More on the latest headlines coming out about the DPRK tensions, I'm joined now by international security expert Jim Walsh. Jim, I want to get your thoughts on this rare briefing. I guess the DPRK has done something most cannot do in this bitterly partisan city. That's everyone putting aside their differences for a short period, Democrats, Republicans coming together. What does this speak to in terms of how much of an issue this really is?
Well, I think most of the senators showed up because they didn't want to skip it and then be blamed for it later. But I don't sense any swelling of bipartisan support for Mr. Trump. And I sent my emails and made my phone calls to try to figure out what was going on. One wag I spoke with said this was a great fat pile of nothing. You know, this is just theater. You read Mattis's and Tillerson's statement, there's nothing in that. None of the senators reported in interviews afterwards that there was anything new in it. I think, it's a wasted opportunity. So he's done this for theater. Maybe it's because it's the first 100 days mark that's coming up, but then he spent that bullet. There might be a time when he actually needs to bring up all 100 senators for something that's really important, and he's just sort of thrown that away on what seems to me nothing more than show.
Yeah, there was a Democratic senator afterwards that said no revelations of any sort. To your point, there's talk of putting the DPRK on the state sponsors of terrorism list. What does that do? How does that change the dynamic?
Nothing. I mean, for all the talk about how, the age of strategic patience is over, this is the same thing, right? This is all he's saying is we're going to have more sanctions. Read any UN panel of experts report, they'll tell you the sanctions aren't working. Read the study that I did with my colleague John Park at Harvard, where we interviewed North Korean defectors whose job was to evade sanctions, and it tells you that the sanctions aren't working. So it's the same old, other than the sort of military bluster, and I don't think there are any military options here, and I think the Trump administration knows there are no military options here. So this strikes me as a lot of talk. We got another day, another issue that's presented itself. The latest, the THAAD installation in the ROK. It's being assembled. First steps installation taking place. There's talk that it could be up and running within a few days. It's producing protests in the ROK, anger in China. China said all along that this is going to further destabilize the peninsula, and China's vowing countermeasures. How does this affect the dynamic? Well, I've not been a fan of THAAD for a long, long time. I've had a very consistent position on this. What strikes me about the most recent developments, though, is why are we rushing this? It sure looks like we're trying to get it installed before the presidential elections in South Korea. That doesn't feel right to me. Shouldn't we let the South Koreans elect their own president and let the president decide what's going to happen next? That doesn't make any sense. Number two, I think because of the summit, the Chinese-U.S. summit, that seemed to go well, and it seems like China is starting to make some moves on North Korea, particularly with respect to oil supplies. That seems to have caught Pyongyang's attention. They've begun rationing gasoline in Pyongyang. So if you're moving in what seems to be a fragile but positive direction, why in the world would you spit on it by doing the one thing that China's most angry about? I don't know. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, let me get your thoughts on that. Is it going to backfire? I mean, obviously you have an election just around the corner with protests being fueled by this. How does it change? You've talked about the election. A lot of people aren't talking about the election. They're talking about the tensions. But this ROK election is very important.
Yeah, it is, Mike, and who knows what the domestic political consequences are. I think the Korean population, South Korean population, as it ever is fairly divided. It's divided on the issue of THAAD. That's what the polling numbers seem to indicate. The candidates have sort of soft-pedaled it. There's some minor differences. But it seems to me, the reasonable thing, they are the U.S. ally, after all. The reasonable thing to do would be allow them to, rather than rush and get it in there before the poor guy is elected, let the election take place, let the new person set policy. If Obama had done this to Trump, he would scream bloody murder. So, again, I've never been a fan of it, but even now as we get down to it, it seems like it's not being handled well.
Jim Walsh joining us from Boston. Thanks so much.